and welcome to the Hybrid School Builders Podcast. I am your host, Rebecca Foley, and I am so glad you are joining me today. I am a fellow grassroots founder who is hoping to make your journey toward founding a sustainable hybrid school a little bit easier. If you are dreaming of starting a hybrid school, or perhaps you've already gotten started, you are in the right place. Join me as we dive into real stories, practical tips, and hard-won lessons that I have learned to help you launch and grow your program with confidence. Remember, building a hybrid school is not just about creating a business or creating jobs. It's not even about just serving the children who attend the program. It's literally about reshaping the landscape of education. And we can do that one community, one entrepreneur, and one program at a time. So today I wanted to give you a little bit more information about the nonprofit and some of the practical things that you need to know if you have decided to start as a nonprofit. Now, as I said in an earlier episode, a nonprofit is more complex to set up and it's more complex to continue to run, okay? Now, this is because a nonprofit is nonprofit. By definition, it exists for the good of some mission, okay? That is stated when you file your paperwork. It can be educational, religious. Those are probably what you're going to be putting, one or both of those, for a hybrid school or a micro school. And therefore, it is more regulated because it is of utmost importance in order to keep tax-exempt status, that the books are kept correctly, and there is a lot of transparency as far as making sure that someone is not profiting from the existence of the organization. Okay, so I'm just going to give you a quick review of the structure, okay? And then I want to talk a bit about the finances, which probably doesn't sound very exciting, but it's something that you really need to make sure is set up correctly from the beginning, because it can be a major pain in the neck to have to go back and fix it if you didn't know that you should have been doing this from the beginning. Okay, so the structure, remember, you have to have a board and you have to have bylaws, okay? And the board is supposed to be governing the organization. Now, governing means that they should be appointing the executive director, and the executive director should then be carrying out the operations. They can do hiring. They can do, they can outsource things. They should be doing the whole organizational management of all of the operational things and the administration and the programs and all of that, which, by the way, let me tell you that it took me a while to know this, and basic nonprofit language is that programs are the actual activities that the nonprofit is carrying out to deliver on the mission. Okay, so for a school, this is the actual programming that you're giving to the families, to the children, right? It's the days of instruction that you're offering. It can also be, you can call it a different program to offer things like summer camps. A different program might be like field trip coordination and that kind of thing. Those are programs, okay? Now, administration is the stuff that undergirds the programs. And yes, there is a little bit of gray area. We'll talk about this when we talk about the bookkeeping, because you should know the basic terminology. Even if you're hiring this all out, you should just understand it so you can speak the language a little bit. The administration is things like the insurances. It's things like the payroll systems and all of that that's necessary in order for the programs to operate, but it's not the actual programming, okay? So like teacher salaries, you only need a teacher if you're running the programming, okay? So that's a programming expense. But something like insurance is an administrative expense. Now, and like I said, it can be a little gray. You say, well, I wouldn't need a payroll system if I didn't have teachers. And that's true. But do a little bit more reading on, like the Foundation Group has some good blog articles and information. They also offer services. They're not super cheap, but they do a really good job, and they specialize in nonprofits. So look at some of their resources if you want to dig a little bit more into the language around this stuff. But just understand that the administration is all of the not so fun stuff that has to happen to undergird the actual programming, and the programming is actually delivering on the mission. That language is important. Okay, so to get back to the board is governing. Okay, they're supposed to be appointing the executive director, and they are also supposed to be making sure that the executive director is held accountable. So they should be checking in yearly. They should be doing a review. They should be doing some sort of like 360 review or something, which, they can do that by like meeting with the director, having them do a self-evaluation, having the other people, the teachers, even the families possibly do some sort of like quick survey, some sort of evaluation to make sure that you're getting feedback from them. And then the board should be meeting with that person, make sure that they understand, and this isn't like a gotcha sort of meeting. That's never a good way of managing, of course. But, and the board may be made up of people who are not bosses and are not managers. Okay. And when that happens, it can cause a bit of it can be a little difficult for them to know what it is they're supposed to be doing or looking for if they haven't in some other, in their other parts of life, managed people and been a boss. So, but essentially the board as a whole needs to be able to understand their job well enough. And hopefully they have a couple of people on the board who can head this up, who do have this experience. Even if it's just one person who's like, yeah, I have people under me. I have to do reviews. I have to do, leadership sort of things in my work. Get someone on your board who knows how to do that and is good at it, hopefully, and understands that they need to make sure the executive director has what they need, that they know how many hours they're working, that they're getting paid fairly, that they have the support they need, but that they also are fairly holding them accountable for whatever gaps they might have. Everybody has gaps. Everybody has strengths, right? And so it's not looking for a gotcha, here's what you're doing wrong. And I hope the executive director is not doing that to his or her staff and teachers. That's never a good way to manage, as I said, but it is making sure that you are finding the gaps and helping them fill them and helping support the executive director. So that's one part of governance. Now, the board is also supposed to be responsible for the financial transparency policies, the budget, the planning budget, as far as is the model sustainable? Now, you don't want to get this mixed up with managing the actual operational budget. That is something that the executive director should be doing. The executive director may actually be building out the planning budget with the help of the treasurer or other staff, depending on how big the staffing is, for the upcoming year. This is how much we need to budget for this area. I think I need more training for my teachers, or, the facility costs went up or whatever. They're gathering that information. They're getting the feedback from the programming, and they're coming up with a planning budget for the, each upcoming year. Okay. In the first year, it might be a lot of guesswork, hopefully very informed guesswork, educated guesses. But then as each year goes on, they're modifying as they're getting more information. Okay. But that's operational budgeting. Now, the board needs to be reviewing that budget, asking smart questions about it, right? And approving it. And that's recorded in the meeting minutes that the board has approved the upcoming budget, because the reason for that is the board is governing. So they are ultimately responsible that this program, that this organization is financially sound and stable. Okay. So if they're glancing at the budget and they're like, oh yeah, it looks fine to me, and then they approve the budget and there's a huge gaping hole in it that's going to put the organization in some sort of financial distress, then that is on them. Okay. It is their job to make sure that they are looking at that closely enough and asking the right questions to understand it and approve it in good faith. Okay. Now, that same principle applies to compliance, legal compliance, making sure the taxes are getting done, making sure that the insurances are purchased. All of that fits into the governance. Okay. Now, I talk in the board training, I talk about the three duties of the board: duty of obedience, duty of care, and duty of loyalty. So those are kind of the philosophical underpinnings of what a board is supposed to be doing and why they do what they do. But that duty of obedience is they need to know what is required for a nonprofit. Okay, they need to know about the yearly 990 that needs to be submitted. They need to know about any state paperwork that needs to go in. They need to know about required insurances to make sure that everything is compliant. They need to know about that stuff, and they need to be holding the operations accountable that it is getting done. Okay, now again, where a lot of can get gray area into a gray area is that some people say, well, is the board actually supposed to go do all of that? Or is that operational? Well, it depends. Okay, they do not need to do it all, and they probably shouldn't be, as far as the expectation of the board members who are volunteers, who are not getting any benefit from serving on the board. Okay, the expectation of them actually going out and preparing the tax form or writing up policy or calling the insurance company is quite possibly too much to ask of a board of volunteers. If board members are willing to do that, those are operational tasks. If they are willing to do that, if the treasurer, it's a small organization, or maybe at least the first year or two, and they say, I will do that as a volunteer, I will go, make some phone calls, I'll get some quotes on insurances. Maybe you have a CPA as your treasurer, and they say, yeah, I can fill out the tax form for you as just a volunteer. I will do that as a board member. They absolutely should not be taking business for their personal business and doing it and getting paid for it. That can get a little questionable, although that is possible if they sit out the vote and the rest of the board says, well, let's just pay their firm to do it, and it's to the benefit of the organization. That is possible. But again, read up on that. You got to be careful about stuff like that. Now, I would advise, however, especially if the organization is larger, that the executive director understands all of this, right? What paperwork needs to be done, the taxes that need to be done, the insurances and all of that. And they are doing it because they're on staff, they're getting paid, or they are hiring somebody, right? They might have an assistant, they might have an administrative director or something like that, who is helping with, human resources and paperwork and, maybe financials and all of that stuff. Okay. And that's operational. They can go hire that person and say, here's your job. You're responsible for these 4 things that need to be done every year. And it should be someone who's qualified and comfortable doing that work. Okay. Then, however, if that happens, then they need to have that paperwork prepared. The board, because this is where there can be a lot of frustration for a founder, or especially if the founder is working as the executive director, which often is what happens, is that they figure out what needs to be done. They do it. They make sure it gets done. And the board is supposed to be checking in on them and supporting them and asking the right questions and looking at it all. And they don't. Okay. This often happens. And it's very frustrating for the director because they are like, well, this, I don't want this place to be illegal or whatever. And they end up trying to figure it out, doing all this extra work. And the board is either unaware of it or of what is being done, or they are just they haven't fulfilled their duty of care to go make sure they understand it and they know it and they've been trained and they put the time into it and they're putting the right people on the board who can look at the paperwork, sign it, send it in, and are also operating to say, hey, I know our paperwork is due in April. Do you need any help? Is that, in your March meeting, you're checking in on that? How is it going? Who's doing it? The board should be checking in on all of that compliance. Okay. So just like the finances and the budget, the board needs to be checking in on all of the compliance. Okay. They're also appointing the executive director and they're holding the executive director accountable. Okay. Now that is all really important, but for it to happen correctly, the board needs to be trained and they need to understand what their job is. Okay. So that's another episode. I have a series on that on YouTube, some basic board training. And so make sure that your board is understanding that. Okay. So program and administration, again, those terms are important to understand when you are doing your accounting. Okay. You need an accountant who understands nonprofit accounting because it is different than small business, for-profit accounting. Some of the biggest differences are any kind of management of donor funds. Now, if you, like us, in our first few years, we barely had any donors, 0 donors, maybe 1. We did very few fundraisers, very little money was fundraised. Okay. But if you're doing any at all, it needs to be labeled correctly. Any donations need to be tracked as donations. They should be given receipts when they give a donation over a certain amount. Fundraisers, if they're like, say, a pizza sale or a shirt sale where the extra proceeds are kept, that's different than, an event that parents are maybe buying tickets for, or some sort of like dinner that the community is involved in. Those things are all different, okay? I advise getting, a kindergarten education on it the best you can by reading up on it from a professional like the foundation group. It can help you to read up on it so that you know how to ask the right questions. But also, if you sit down, you find an accountant, you sit down with them, and you ask your questions like, what do I need to know? What do I need to tell you? What's the difference between these 3 different fundraising events that we might hold? What kind of language do I need to understand to tell you what those are? Okay. After you explain to them who you are and what you're doing, right? Now, your tuition is coming in, it probably as your primary source of revenue. I advise that it pretty much funds all of your operations, but depending on what your mission is, that may not be the case. But that is fee for service, meaning that the parents who are being served are paying a fee for the service. It is not a tax deductible donation for the parents. Okay, you can't do that, right? If they are paying beyond what the cost of the service is, if they're, donating beyond that, that's tax deductible. But say it costs, $2,500 a year to educate the children, cost per child, and they're paying that is a fee for the service. Okay, it's not tax deductible. But any donations from other people who are getting no services, those are tax deductible and a nonprofit. Okay, so there's the revenue part of it where you need to understand the fundraising and the donors. And then, there's basic bookkeeping that you need to understand. It just at a kindergarten level, as far as like as transactions are coming in, that they're just getting labeled. So that's as they're coming in and also as they're going out. The major part of the expenses as they're going out, you're spending money, right? You're paying teachers, you're paying the executive director. Those are the salaries, right? You're paying rent probably in your building, you're buying curriculum and supplies, you're paying insurances, right? You have these basic expenses that you're going to have. You want to be labeling those for what they are. You don't need to go into major detail on like, this is pencils for 4th grade, but you do want to have like a supplies category and a curriculum category. Because it's a nonprofit, you probably want to have like administrative and program. So if it's supplies and curriculum that are specific to the students, specific to delivering on the mission, those are program supplies, okay? And then if it's more administrative, like office sort of things, that's one of the grayer areas. It is administrative, but if the teachers are using a central printer to print papers for the classroom, that's really program, right? So sometimes you have to like split those two things. Even the rent, sometimes you can assign like a percentage to the administrative part, like the office work that's happening in the back. The majority of the rent should be allocated toward the programming because it's probably classrooms and students, right? So again, this is just a high level overview, and you really only need to understand this on a kindergarten level if you are going to be hiring it out, which I highly recommend. Okay. So your treasurer should understand basic nonprofit accounting, but the executive director or whoever is handling the finances also, and as far as like overseeing the bookkeeping and the accounting and talking to the accountant and the bookkeeper, should understand that. Okay. There's a very helpful course that you can get through TechSoup. You have to register with TechSoup as a nonprofit, called QuickBooks for Nonprofits. It's obviously just QuickBooks. There's other bookkeeping software besides QuickBooks, and there's some that are specifically for nonprofit bookkeeping. If you're doing a lot of donor management, you might want to check one of those out. Like if you're doing a lot of fundraising and a lot of donors, that you probably want to use one of those specialized ones. But if most of what you're bringing in and sending out is really just operational, like you don't have a lot of donations from fundraising, you might want to use QuickBooks. You can get it for a decent price through TechSoup, and you can also take this course called QuickBooks for Nonprofits. It's like a 5-hour video course, and it's very helpful just for you to understand some of the basic language. It does actually show you how to do the bookkeeping. So if you want to try to do that in the beginning, that will give you the basic tools to do it. But it's also just helpful so you understand what's going on. Okay. All right. So to review all of that, your board should be governing. Okay. They should understand the basic compliance, financials, and be making sure the executive director is accountable and they're supporting them and they're doing their job. And they need to be people who, you should have 1 or 2 people on the board who understand management and evaluation. You should have a treasurer who understands basic nonprofit accounting. You should have someone on the board who understands a little bit of legal paperwork sort of things so that they can help oversee things like that. Usually an officer of the board has to sign those papers. They are legally responsible to make sure all of that is done and done well. The transparency procedures and all of that, they should be looking at all of that and making sure that is in place to make sure that it's all on the up and up. The same person isn't doing all of the financials with nobody else ever seeing it. That's, again, the board's job to make sure governance, financial transparency is in place. And the nonprofit accounting needs to be set up well from the beginning. If you end up applying for grants, especially larger grants, they will often want to see in a budget, and you want to be able to accurately give them a rundown of how you are spending your money, how many donations you're getting, how many donors you have, if you have that, but also how much is being spent on programming and how much is being spent on administration. That's a big thing for donors. They don't want to see a whole bunch of their donation going toward, a director's salary or other like overhead costs. They want to see it going toward the programming. So you want to keep your books so that you can do that. If you ever end up applying for very large grants, sometimes they want to see 3 years of audited statements, and that's not a cheap thing to have done. But if you're going to get it done at any point, it's several $1,000s, maybe up to $10,000 to have an independent audit done of your books. But you have to have kept those books for 3 years correctly in order to do that. Okay. So make sure that you're finding a bookkeeper who knows nonprofit language. You can use Foundation Group if you budget for it and you're willing to pay for it. They do a lot of that support for nonprofits, but make sure that your board and your executive director understand the basic language of all of it. And please make sure that your board is trained and that the right people are on the board who are competent to fulfill their duty, but also to just check in on the things that they are responsible for without having them actually do the operations. Okay? Thanks so much for listening today. Don't forget to subscribe and make sure you check out the resources I am developing at startahybridSchool.com. Send me an email anytime. I would love to hear from you. Until next time.